face looks like. I'm Cassie Sepulowski. I currently am the Senior Director of Data Solutions at a nonprofit called One Goal. I also do some independent contracting work with a company called Fortify that basically contracts out hours to smaller nonprofits. I've been a Salesforce MVP since 2021. I also co-lead our Chicago nonprofit Trailblazer Group. I've been using Salesforce since 2014. I've got a couple of certifications under my belt, 15-ish times presenting at various Dreamin' events. I think I'm up to like 2 countries and 6, 7, or 8 states now. And yes, this is my second time at Automation Hour, so I'm so excited to be back. I also have a little side passion project, which is an admin job board for really directed at entry level or Salesforce admin tangent jobs for those looking to break into the ecosystem. So there's a bit.ly there. Twitter, LinkedIn, Trailblazer community. If you Google Cassie Sepulowski, I promise you'll find me. There really is only one of me. I'm happy to connect. Find me, reach out, let me know, where we cross paths, and excited to continue meeting folks. You can also access these slides at bit.ly/AutoHour Fantastic Flows. If there's not access now, I will get to that and make sure it's shared later correctly, but in case you want to come back to that later. So about this session, this is a little bit of a hybrid session. So we're not gonna, I'm not gonna open up a flow and dig into a niche case scenario of building out a flow. But I've done this presentation a couple of times and people seem to really enjoy it. So I figure why not keep sharing it. So this is kind of what we're gonna look at today. We're gonna start with how to find your flow. So the session really started because I didn't always love flow. I imagine like many who've been in the ecosystem for more than just a few years, that old flow builder really terrified me. And it took me a while to get in. Obviously, there's been some changes with the technology along the way, but wanted to talk about kind of how I approached getting into flow and what I think might help others as well. So some flowtivation and flowmentum to get you inspired to use flows. Some places that you can use flows inside of Salesforce, so the different places that you can actually have them pop up. And the thing I always focus on when I present is lots and lots of resources and learning and next steps. Anytime you come to a webinar, you're not going to walk away an expert on something, but hopefully you can have a refined set of resources that maybe can help you in your journey. And again, if you're accessing these slides later, you're going to see this little flow robot in some of the corners down here. If you click on that, that is going to be linked to a resource related to that page, in addition to the resources at the end of the slides. So a brief history in flow. If you're new to the ecosystem, this is kind of how we got to where we are. If you've been around for a while, you probably know some of these milestones. These are always the things that kind of stood out to me as I've been following this history of flow and the journey of flow as a tool and a technology inside of Salesforce. So spring 2019 is when we got the new flow builder. So it wasn't this like terrifying, like code-centric looking thing anymore. I know when I used to go in there, I was like, what are resources and what are collections and what's an S object and how the heck do I do these things? And so that was when we got the new flow builder. It makes you feel happier. It's nicer to be in. It's easier to manage. And then in winter 20, Salesforce automatically stores record variables. So that was a big deal because there used to be this saying that I shared is that flows don't know anything. And I actually heard that from Jen Lee back in the day. And that was kind of when the old flows clicked for me. It was like, okay, you got to tell flows everything. Everything you want it to touch or use or manipulate or change, you have to tell it. And in winter 20, that became not true. Salesforce stores the record variables, so you don't have to create everything. So that was a big milestone, especially to help flow be more accessible, because you didn't have to think about every resource or every variable you needed. Now, plenty of folks still use those things and create them manually, and that's really fine. Personal preference is to let Salesforce do the work for me. Summer 20 was a big deal because we had record triggered flows. So a lot of folks always thought flow, screen flow, there's a visual component to it, or you've got to launch it from a process builder or trigger it some other way. So in summer 20, we got record triggered flows, which means you could set off a flow based on something on an object. So contact phone number changes, go do a thing. There's a new record, go do a thing, whatever it might be. And so that was really where we started to get some more of this parity between process builder and flow. And it only gets better from here. So there's lots and lots of other enhancements to flow that aren't here. These are the ones that are kind of making it, the big bold statements. Went to 22, process builder and workflow retirement announcement. So that's actually when Salesforce officially came out and said, hey, flow is the future, 100%, like no asterisk, like we're going to eventually, you're not going to be able to build out process builder and workflow. I think in winter 23, we actually will no longer be create new workflows. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the statement. And really they're saying at a certain point, you can't create new ones, and we don't know when yet, I don't think, but down the road, you'll actually be forced to move anything to flow. But good news is you're here, so you're ready to start using flow now. And one of the cool things in winter 23, again, lots and lots of other things coming out, but update related records for record triggered flows. So that's another thing that you'll see all over the blog, the announcements for winter 23 with flows. We've got data tables now, you've got conditional things, all sorts of fun stuff in there. But these were really the big things to say, okay, yes, flow is the future, and this is going to be our declarative automation tool. So getting started with flow, I think it's helpful, and this was helpful for me, and I share this with folks who are just like, oh, I just feel so intimidating. How do I get started? I think my headline is don't underestimate your current skills. There are a lot of things that transfer into thinking about how to build, how to use, how to manipulate flows. So process mapping. If you don't have a process, you don't have a flow. So you better have a process to start with before you even open up Flow Builder. So if you have sketched something out, if you have talked through the series of steps it takes to get something done, you have started to think in the way that flow is built. Flow is meant to be, multi-path, if then, decisions, lots of things. You can always sketch in a visual or plain text version first. A lot of folks do this with flow, with formulas. Write it out in words, in words first. Don't worry about the tools. Don't worry about the technology. Just say, what is this process supposed to do? And then you can start relating it or translating it into a flow. Object relationships. Again, you're going to struggle in flow if you don't know your data design in your system, your data structure. So knowing how things are related, if thinking about related records and parent-child records and the different lookup options and the different relationships, even just being able to think about those relationships, especially if you think about multiple tiers of relationships. Again, those are the kinds of like mental skills that it takes to be able to start thinking about flow. You just have to kind of translate it into seeing it in the tool as well. Formulas and validation rules. I think formulas and validation, like formulas in Salesforce, yes, but even if you know Excel and you have built formulas in Excel, that is like the gateway to Salesforce. That is honestly how I got my job. They said, can you build a fancy Excel spreadsheet? And I said, you betcha. They said, you're hired. And so if you have built formulas or you've built validation rules, that definitely has set you up for success with starting to think about flows and even how to use formulas and flows. And if you are brand new to flows, those are a great way to kind of exercise your brains, just to kind of think in the way that you need to think when building a flow. Web forms, form assembly, form stack, form titan, any of those things, whether it's related to Salesforce or not, a lot of the connectors that you might be building or conditional field views, again, those are all the kinds of things, the skills that you can take and reuse inside of flow to make flow not feel so scary or intimidating if you're new to it, or you're just, you're starting to use it more. Importing and upserting data. Again, it's a skill that you have to understand your object relationships. Same thing you have to do if you're building a flow and you need to figure out, okay, if I start on this object, how do I get to the next one? Where do I need to update objects? Where do I need to get records? That's the same kind of thing if you're thinking about mass or bulk updating and upserting data. You have to think about all those things. It's the same skills, just a different tool. And if you've done any sort of integration at all, again, that kind of mapping, again, is the kind of thing that you can lean on and gives you experience to be able to translate that to flow. The thing I like to remind folks is like, if you're lost, that's okay. There's a lot of lingo out there, and transparently, it's possible that since the last time I updated these slides, some of the language has changed again. But as a reminder, here's what all of these things mean. Salesforce Flow is the product that encompasses building, managing, running flows, and currently processes in Process Builder. So Process Builder actually sits under the product of Salesforce Flow. Flow Builder is the place where you go and build your flow. It's the point and click. You're dragging and dropping options. You're building out screens, actions or screens. That's where you're actually going and creating the flow. And then the flow itself is an application that automates business, collecting data, using a screen flow inside of Salesforce or an external system. So in short, Salesforce Flow product includes multiple tools. One of them, Flow Builder, helps you create flows. So again, if you're like, well, flow builder, this is kind of how it all relates together. So you know kind of what we mean when we say builder versus a flow versus Salesforce flow of the product. So this is the path that I'm going to talk through. And this is actually kind of the journey that I took when I was building out flows. So I think this is a good way if you want, if, especially if you're new to flow, a way to kind of step through and increment the complexity of what you're building, kind of do a release of responsibility for yourself for what you're doing, riskiness of what you're building. And so I love to start with login flows. Is one of the first flows I built, and honestly, it was the simplest thing, but the fact that it had the word flow on it made me feel like a superhero. I was like, oh yes, I did it. It's a flow. And these are great. If you haven't, again, this is a place where you can use flow that maybe you didn't know about before. So login flows direct users through a login process before they can actually access your org or community. They help control the business process that your users should follow when they're logging into Salesforce. You can be redirected again to an org or community. One thing to note is you can only have one active login flow per profile. So imagine someone's got to sign some paperwork or sign off on some things or onboarding a new hire where you need them to update phone number and email or whatever it might be. You can do that with a login flow. Also great if maybe you have some downtime in your system that happens during working hours and folks need to stay out, or you want to let them know like, hey, things might look funny for a little bit, let them know. Or maybe you want to let them know with a different message about an upcoming release. So if you've seen like the release announcement in your org, that's, I don't know if behind the scenes it's a login flow, but that's exactly what it looks like. So again, some more of those examples. And so you can start really simple, add a logo or a login message. Say, the first time someone logs in, say, welcome, we're so excited to have you on the team. Or, the 10th time they log in, say, hey, great, you logged in 10 times, way to go. Again, like I mentioned, you can collect or update user data. You can do all sorts of stuff here. But I think the place to start, if you're starting with flows and you're kind of just trying to get your feet wet, is that login message or a logo. So this is a very simple version. It can actually be simpler than this. You can cut out that decision piece and just have a screen, and that would be your login flow. In this example, we're making a decision to say, okay, is this our PDs, our program directors, or our teachers? So that's our community users. So we want to show them one screen. We want to show our staff another. Again, we could have one screen for everyone, in which case you just wouldn't have that orange diamond there. The decision there, you would just have one screen. So this is what it looks like in the flow builder. So you have that decision element. And in our case, we're saying if the user role name contains customer, then that's our teachers. If not, then have the default outcome and go to that other screen that would be staff members. So you can use display text, you can add images now. Again, I think from the time I showed this till now, there's even more functionality you can have in there. You can actually have conditions within the same screen. So you may not even need a decision action there. You might actually be able to control it on the screen itself. But for example, here, every year we have to transition our data so that it represents the new school year. And we just let people know, hey, while we're doing this, things might look a little off. Don't be alarmed. That's expected. Come back at the end of the day and it should be all set. So within setup, you actually go two places. So you have your flow, and then you actually go to login flows, which is where you kind of connect those two pieces together. So setup, home, login flows under identity, and then you're going to name what your login flow is in this case, it's a maintenance notification. And then you're going to, this is where you're going to select which flow it's going to run through. So, and again, you can see the profile here. So I mentioned one login flow per profile. So you can only set one here. And again, as long as it's active, they're going to see it. You can deactivate it. You can have other conditions on it. And let's see if I can get this video to play here. You can see this is recorded from True North Dreamin' back in, I think, 2019. So I've got all sort of branded. But here you can see I've got both an image at the top and display text. They see that, they click finish, they're done, they've logged in. As simple as that. If you do that, congratulations, you have built a flow. And it's beautiful and it's handy and it'll probably bring a smile to people's faces. Next up on the docket, I think a before save update flow. So this wasn't always my second step because before save update flows weren't always a thing. But when they became part of the new product or enhancement to the product, I think they're really handy. And I think there's a really interesting use case here that has totally changed the game for our org. So I'm going to show that as a demo. as an example. So before save updates in Flow are faster than any other available record triggered updates. They're 10 times faster than an update and a record change process that's built in Process Builder. You can help avoid, the limit for CPU timeouts, but keep in mind, a before save update cannot access field values that are only set after the record is saved. So like an ID, a last modified date, anything like that, you're not going to be able to access here because technically the record isn't saved yet. You can't create or update related records, and you can't perform anything other than updating the record that launches the flow. So here's that reference to, this is in the architect's decision guide, how many times as long as before save apex trigger does a trigger built in this tool take to perform a same record field update across a batch of 200 records. So most important thing here is this before save flow 3.59 compared to this process builder 122.57. So if you haven't heard already, again, flow is going to be so much more efficient than process builder, partially because of how they've built in the decision handling. But this is the reason that they're putting their efforts into flow and saying, workflow rule, process builder, you got to go. So again, this is, I always show this when every time I'm talking about flow or, moving things over. And I remind myself, like, this is why our process builders take a little while to run, or they don't always run efficiently or effectively. Very similar, kind of diagram. You see kind of the same scale of the average overhead added to a single record save by the same record field update trigger. So again, you see this before save flow down here, very little overhead added compared to our process builder, or even a process builder plus an auto launch flow, which is this second to last bar here. So again, before save flow, if you can use it, if you meet the criteria, if you don't need to do any of the things that they can't do, before save flow is the way to go. And so when you go into flow, you're going to see this here, you're going to see fast field updates. That's the before save. So you see there it says runs before the record is saved to the database. And the use case we have for this is this simple. That is our flow. And it changed and simplified our work so much. So let me talk through this example. The use case for this was we have a junction object, which is called a college application. It is a junction between a student and a college. So it's where the student plans on applying to college. They can have many students can be the same college. One student can have many college applications. If anyone has ever tried to do a duplicate or matching rule on a junction object, it is not great. I learned that even if you use a lookup field in a duplicate or matching rule, it doesn't look up the record, it looks up the text. So they happen to have two Cassie Sepulowskis, it's going to say those are the same, even if they have different underlying record IDs. And so, we try to do as much as we could, and we always still ended up with duplicates. And so this was actually a trick from someone in the MVP community. So what we did is we created a compound key in a before save flow. And so here we say we're going to update the records, and we created a new field called compound key. And that compound key, again, this is a before save. That compound key is a concatenation of the student record ID and the college record ID to truly create a unique combination of those two that then we can use in the duplicate rules. Now, why this is important to be, especially in a before save rule, is thinking about your order of execution. So in this case, the before save is going to run before the duplicate rules. If we try to do this in an after save, duplicate rules are not going to be able to reference this, and it's not going to do any good. But because we can put this in a before save, it's going to be there when the duplicate rules go try and run, and it's actually going to do its job. So that's why this flow is so simple but so beautiful, is because all you're doing is putting two record IDs together, and now you can use this in a duplicate rule, and you can totally change the way that you're managing data in your system. So definitely huge shout out to Gaurav Seth for documenting this use case on his blog. He actually went back and chatted a bit about it because he had some old flow documentation, and there was new flow resources when I used this. And so again, just another highlight to how great the community is, just to reach out, chat, get ideas for how you can use this kind of stuff. But a great example of a really simple, low risk, like low complexity flow. Another one that I really love that is, again, super useful in our org is a screen flow to update the current record. Now you're thinking, okay, well, you're updating the record you're on. Why aren't you just using the UI? And I will show you. Let's talk about users and talk about complex data. So when a student in our program leaves, we need to change their status. We need to know what semester they left during. We need to know the date they left the program, why they left the program, additional note about the why they left the program, all these things. Now, some of these we can handle with validation rules. But again, if you've dealt with validation rules, you can't always cover every scenario. It also depends on what order they save the fields in. Do they edit them all at once? We can't require the fields because they're only required in the case that a student changes status or they leave the program. So instead, what we did was we have a screen flow where we take all of these fields that have to be updated if a student leaves the program, and now boom, on the flow screen, they're required because they're only required when you're trying to do that specific thing. So now we don't have to have users try to remember what fields do we need to update, when do they need to be updated, in what order, do they all have to be filled out, do they really all have to be filled out, what doesn't have an asterisk. Now we can see it's in the screen, everything is required. They can't complete that task until everything is entered. So again, it's a pretty simple flow here. You're going to get the information from the record you're on. So this is actually a button on a contact record. I'll show you that in a minute. You're going to see the information for, removing the fellow from the cohort or moving the student from the class. You're going to assign all the updates. You're going to update the actual record, and you're going to finish. You're going to say, thanks so much for updating your data. And of course, because you're a good admin, you're going to have a fault screen. There's some good resources out there for how to send fault emails as well, and to do that a little bit more smoothly than what maybe I've done here. But again, it's a pretty simple flow. It only has a handful of components on there. There's no loops or anything like that. It's intended to be used for one record at a time. And it makes sure that our data is clean. So here you can see how we're referencing. We are, referring to the ID. And I think actually there's a different workaround for this now. I think you can actually just use record ID. I don't even know if you need to create it in the same way, but again, flow has changed so much. I haven't always kept up with all of it. And here again, that's where you see this ability to have Salesforce store the fields versus create them yourself. You can automatically store all of the fields. You can choose to choose certain fields and let Salesforce do the rest. I tend towards using that middle option. I've heard some caution about like automatically storing all fields, especially if you're going to have more than one record and just processing. I don't know like the limit or the time or how much processing, all of that. But I figure if I know exactly what fields I want, in this case, I'm just going to pick them. But if you're not sure what you're ever going to want to use and you don't have to update this every time, then you can use automatically store all fields. And certainly if you're old school or for whatever reason, you can also choose which fields and assign the variables yourself. So that was like the old flow way. That was when flows didn't know anything. So that's kind of wrapping back to that intro. So here you see we've got this button that we've added to the contact, and this is a action on our contact, and we're just saying here's the flow that you should use. So they see the button, they're going to click that, and they're going to open up that screen that we saw. There's a bonus here because another way that you can and should use flows is a subflow. So we actually have a button for updating status, and within that flow, there's subflows where you can say add a cohort, remove a cohort, or sorry, add a student, remove a student, update a student, etc. And so that's where you can have a flow that then makes a decision and launches off to other flows. Again, lots of great resources out there on the use cases for subflows, why to use them, how to use them to compartmentalize your information. I think again, Jen Lee, Flowmatic, she's got lots of resources out there about how to build reusable flows, and part of that is using subflows. So just want to highlight that here too as another kind of feature of flows that we're using. So again, you see that remove fellow, so it's actually being launched from another flow. Again, we're going to pass in that record ID. So that's where I mentioned you can just use the reference to the record ID versus not necessarily having to create the separate variable. And next we have a review and modify existing flows. So this was like kind of the next big step for me. So because before save didn't actually exist when I was getting into flow, I think I skipped that one, and this review and modify existing flows was the next big milestone. It was scary, but there were flows that people on my team had built and needed to be updated, and that felt much less intimidating than trying to create a flow from scratch myself, because I could go into that flow and I could start to see how it was built, why it was built, try to make sense of it, It's also a great way to still learn, even if you're not gonna modify a flow. If you have flows in your org, or people have webinars, there's lots of automation hours where people are walking through a flow and showing the screen. Pause the screen and see if you can translate that flow back into plain language. So just like, you can practice by saying, okay, let's write it out first and then get it into a flow. Try doing the opposite. Flow and, learning technology and things like this sort of is like a language. You have to be able to translate it both ways. And so that's another great way to practice that skill and say, okay, can I take a flow that I know very little about and try to make sense of it based on what I do know about what flows are capable of? And even if you don't get the exact right answer, it's going to be a way to kind of practice and understand the different pieces that are available to you in flow, and how you might be able to use them. So I showed this before as a way to update our removing a student from our program. So this was an early version of it. And now it actually looks like this. One, because we became more comfortable with the tool, so we could make it do more. Two, because our processes got more complex. Also, it's okay to build a flow that doesn't do every single thing. We have some flows where we say, okay, if X, Y, and Z is true, show a screen that says, create a case, and we'll do this manually. Or, sorry, the flow isn't smart enough to do that. Go do A, B, and C instead. And that's okay, because that gives you room to grow, figure out your processes. And again, automating 80% of the use cases is still better than not having any of those use cases automated. So that's something to keep in mind too. If you have a process that feels very, very, very complex, don't feel like you need to get it into flow for the very first go around. See what are the things that are most common and turn that into a flow. So you can see here we've got different statuses, depending on when the student started the program, what status they need to have at the end, and a couple other decisions that happen along the way. So again, from this to this. And again, that was over time. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't the first iteration, but an example of how you can continue to build on your flows. So you can see here we have this field. One of the fields is in what new status you want. So you saw here there's this decision for what they might have two different paths for what their current status is. And so we can store that on each of those decision paths and then have it getting ahead of myself, and then use it in the assignment. And so depending on which path it goes down, that variable is going to be set in different ways. And then in your assignment, you're just using one variable. Again, so if all of that made you go, huh? Don't worry about it. Try it with just one where you're not worrying about a decision or you've got just one status. So again, going back to our screen flow, this was our first version of it. Actually, that's a lie. This is probably like version 3 or 4. The very first version was a single screen. And now it looks like this. So we have, and again, we don't have this on all the time, but we have added in an option for on that screen flow for a teacher to add feedback. So there's a little checkbox that says, thanks for logging in. Would you like to leave some feedback about the system? And then yes or no. Again, that's only going to show if they're a teacher. You can go find their user. There's also a path here for a reminder. So they can also say, don't want to give feedback right now, but ask me again in 10 days or 15 days or however long. And so again, this wasn't even like the next iteration. This was multiple iterations from that first one you saw. And then again, you've got, a subflow here. So again, this is where you actually say, okay, yes, they want to leave feedback, then go to this flow where we're actually going to gather that feedback. We have another example of enhancing your flows. We have a flow for folks to submit cases because we wanted to be able to have resources on a screen and say, hey, did you check these things first? Here's our frequently asked questions. What kind of case is it? Be able to conditionally display different resources or things like that. But the first version of it looked like this. It said there's a screen, it created a record. There was another screen that said thank you, that was it. And now, and again, this isn't even the latest version of it. This is probably now currently has even 5 or 7 more actions or more actions on it. So here we added in the ability to create a case on behalf of a user. So you see this decision is user and administrator. So if someone decides to G-chat me instead of creating a case, I can say, great, let me create this as a case for you. And I can go in, and at this point, then it'll say, okay, looks like you're an admin. Do you actually want to assign somebody else as the requester? And I can do that without worrying about having to flip it back manually. Once the case is created, that ensures that all of the communication goes out the right way. Um, and then we also added in a screen that says, hey, that looks like it's a really quick due date. Are you sure that's when you need it? So adding in some more of these things where we can say, let the system be smart so we don't have to do these manual updates or changes or notifications. And again, just an iteration of that. And even now, like I said, it includes more where we can, escalate it to a certain queue. Instead, we have an additional requirement on there where they have to confirm that they have checked the resources. So again, an example of enhancing your flows along the way, and a great use case for how to use flows to solve some of the challenges that you may have as an admin. We've got examples of keeping your data clean. This is a great example of making sure that folks are using your systems and that you are getting requests and things in a timely and efficient way. All right, and my last example, though certainly not the last step in this flow journey, is a simple flow that creates or updates related records. So this is really the first time in this part that we're talking about related records. I do think there's an increased complexity when you start talking about related records. That's where a really, really, really strong understanding of your data model is going to come in handy, of how relationships work, what's the parent, what's the child, what can you reference? And again, because we're talking about related records, this is going to be an after save flow. So keep in mind, again, before save, you can only access the record that you're on. And so this automatically is going to mean we're in an after save flow. So this is an example where we are automatically creating a child record. So again, we've talked about students changing statuses. Just to give you some additional context in our org. When students sometimes are added in a certain program year, they need additional records created. And in this case, it's a FAFSA record. So that's how they're going to apply for financial aid. It's where we're storing that information about what, when they've submitted, et cetera. But those are created in bulk at a certain point. But then after that, if a student gets added, they still need that record. And so we were either going back manually and creating those, or record counts or report counts were off because they didn't have the record, or people were confused because they didn't know how to update it because it didn't exist. And so he said, hey, let's make the system do this for us. And so now we can say, all right, if a record is created for the first time and these things are true, or if a record is updated to say these things are true, go ahead and create a child record related to that parent. And so again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There are way more complex things you could do here. You could create multiple child records. You could create child records on multiple objects. You could do all sorts of things. But again, this is a great example of like a flow that does something really useful, and the flow is not that complex. My screen going here. So again, you can trigger when your flow is going to run. So in this case, you can say just when it's created, only when it's updated, when it's deleted. In this case, it could be either. So we're going to say the status is one of these two statuses, or it is new. And that's where you see this decision here if it's a new record or if it's an existing record. So again, if it's an existing record, what we want to do is check to see if those child records exist first. We're going to count and see if we find any. If we don't find any, then we're going to create that record. But we know that if that parent record is new, there's no way that those child records exist, because the child records can't exist without the parent. So again, you have your enter criteria. You can, set your condition requirements and or. And again, this is part of the reason that Flow is so much more efficient than Process Builder. Is because essentially when you're setting these entry criteria or entry conditions, if it doesn't meet them, it's never really even going to enter the flow. Whereas with Process Builder, those entry criteria, it still has to do a bit of processing, or for lack of a better term, to get into the Process Builder. And I'm sure there are documents and resources out there that explain this much more eloquently than I am right now. But again, it's kind of like, how far along does the system have to run before it says, oops, nope, I don't need to do this, I can stop. And the short answer is with Flow, it doesn't have to, it has to do much less. And so that's why they're more efficient for processing and CPU time. So again, we saw that fast field updates with the before save, and now you're going to say actions and related records. That's basically your after save. And again, you have more options here. So you can say every time this record is updated, or only when it's updated to meet the condition requirements. So I don't want a child record created every single time this record is touched. I only want it when it changes the student status. Um, and so another example here is a flow component on a Lightning page. So again, this is an example of, again, we're going to create a child record for our contact, but instead of doing it automatically, we're actually going to do it with a screen. So you see this little box here, maybe, there we go, create a GPA record. So we can add a flow to the contact record that allows someone to create a GPA, which is a child record for us, to the contact, and we can default some information. Behind the scenes, it's actually saying, okay, based on what we know about this student, should it, what will we expect the end date would be? What do we think the semester will be? Let's default the format to the one we think is most likely to happen. We're also on the back end choosing the record type based on the contact's region. So no one sees any of that. They just say, oh, wow, 3 of the 4 fields that I need to fill in are already done here. If I need to change them, I can. Otherwise, I can enter a GPA value and hit next. So you're going to do this in your Lightning page builder. And so there's the flow component, you drop it on there, you're going to pick the flow, and then you're going to say, again, you need an input variable, and in this case, it's going to be the record ID, the record that the component is on. So again, at the end of the day, not that complex. This is the flow that is on that page. And so again, it has gotten increasingly more complex over time, but your flow could actually just be this, and you could add that there as well to create that child record. We added the complexity because our system has gotten more complex, because it covers more scenarios, because we've become smarter with flow, because flow has become smarter. But at the end of the day, this flow could be this simple, depending on all of those different factors. So don't let this intimidate you, but know that you can get here, that this is, useful, and it's just talking about, walking through it in an iterative process. So lots of examples, lots of things thrown at you. Again, the idea is giving you some examples for how you can use flow, how to get started with flow, whether you're just figuring out how to use it in your organization for the first time. Maybe you don't have any, maybe you're moving to flow from different automations. So thinking about also how this flow can help you take workflow and process builder and create them in a more efficient way. Don't just lift and shift all of your other automation to flow. Make sure you're actually thinking about, okay, how should I use subflows or not, or use the flow orchestrator to organize my flows. So point being, flow is not as scary as you think anymore. I will admit fully that at a time it felt very scary. But I promise it isn't, especially because there's lots of things you can do in flow that are very simple, but very rewarding and very effective for what you need to get done. Wherever you are, you're ready. I promise you, whether you're just going to create a login flow or you want to create a child record or whatever it might be, you can find a use case and you can try it out. Another point to think about is, what are some of the flows that help you as an admin or a developer, whatever role you are in. Our flow that is about creating a case, we get to play with the most because it's really just for us. Like, yes, people are using it to enter information, but what happens on the back end, we're the ones reading cases. And so we can kind of tweak that. So think about what are the things that really might just be changing and enhancing your work. And maybe, what can you do? Maybe it's actually an action that just you do. Maybe you create a flow just for yourself that, creates a user or does something. Maybe it closes a case, something like that. There are multiple avenues for entries you've seen here. There's different ways that you can start on this. If you're super comfortable with other automation, you can probably jump in and create some other flows that are more complex. Again, it's kind of getting over the barrier of like, oh, flow is this big scary thing. And I promise you, there's no shortage of resources. In my opinion, there's not enough out there about formulas. We need more of it. Selfish plug, Mary Tagler is presenting at our user group next week on fundamentals of formulas that she did at Dreamforce. But that's, there's a couple things out there about formula, but flow, there's so much. There always was, and there will continue to be, and even more so because of the new flow builder, because that's where they're making all of their enhancements. Salesforce is all in on flow, and so everyone is leaning in there. And so there are, whatever your learning style is, there's videos, there's documentation, there's walkthrough, there's Trailhead. There's classes on Udemy. There are, people that do user groups and things like that. So keep that in mind and know that the Trailblazer community is there with you and for you to support you wherever you are in trying to get into this, or if you get stuck, or even if you have maybe flow, but you're trying to think about the specific use case that you can't wrap your head around. Definitely reach out to the community, reach out to your local user group, keep coming to things like this, so you can ask those questions and get ready to present in the future. Automation Hours always need presenters, so maybe you'll be up here next time sharing what you have done with Flow. So again, you saw the little robot on the slides, and then we also have lots of resources here. FlowFest V2, that is out of date, but lots and lots of stuff here. This is nowhere near a complete list of resources, but some of the ones that I think have stood out, or I hear from other folks share the most. But like I said, if you put some time in Google, you're going to find whatever it is that you need to learn Flow, or to learn how to build a flow for your use case. So because it's October and I have a soft spot for David S. Pumpkins, we now are in the question and answer portion. So any questions from the presentation that I can answer?
Thank you so much for the great session. So we have one comment. It's a great use case for before safe flow.
Thank you. Yeah, shout out to Gaurav.
Mark is asking, do you use auto layout by any chance? Because he said that you are not using auto layout in your presentation.
I'm not. Transparently, the screenshots from these are from some older flows and older presentations, but I haven't used auto layout so far. Every time I've tried to use it, it's been a point where I'm just like, I'm just not ready to learn the benefits and all of that. So I'm still in the place where I like to drag and drop. But I also haven't started a flow from scratch for the first time, or in a while. A lot of the building I've been doing is in older flows that we're just enhancing. And so it's on my to-do list, but I have not been using it. But I'm curious if there's flags or questions other folks have about the auto layout. I know for a while it was sort of beta and people had qualms with it.
All right, so he's saying not a questions, but with Winter 23 release, we have an option to update related records via a record trigger flow. Okay, Raya is asking, do we have to create unit test for flows?
As far as the Salesforce standards of 75% coverage on tests, that is not part of test coverage currently. I cannot speak to what Salesforce plans to do, but you can create tests. I have not tried that feature yet. Again, it's on our list of things to do in our org. Would I be surprised if there ended up being a requirement around building tests for flows? No, but that is not currently a requirement. And I don't know if building tests is still beta or if it's GA now, but it's still pretty new. So they usually don't put requirements around stuff for a little while after they release something new.
That's all. We don't have any other questions. Thanks again, everyone.
Things are really great. Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, thank you. This is a very great session, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions on Twitter, on YouTube, and Trailblazer community. Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.